All right, we get to explore kind of the origins of Earth in this one. So chapter 15 will take in two parts, and in this section we'll look at early Earth and the origin of life, and then the major events in the history of life. Um, so these would essentially be the best essential questions. So um, what's the origin of life? And what's the history of life? Okay, those would be our two essential questions. I think that would make the best for those. Okay, so looking at the early Earth and his origin of life, I'll be honest, these are not my favorite sections, but we'll make our way through them. Okay, so Earth was formed about 4.6 billion years ago, and that's a good number to know. Okay, as Earth cooled and the bombardment slowed around 3.9 billion years ago, the conditions on the planet were extremely different from those today. So the first atmosphere probably had thick water vapor, so it's like a foggy day all the time. It's thick and humid everywhere. There were probably various compounds released by volcanic eruptions, including nitrogen and its oxides, so nitroxide and um, nitrates and nitrites and those things. Carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and hydrogen sulfide. So a lot of just nasty stuff. Okay, lightning, volcanic activity, and UV radiation were more intense than they were today. The earliest evidence for life on Earth actually comes from these 3.5 billion year old fossils of stromatolites, and they're built by kind of ancient photosynthetic prokaryotes that are actually still around today. And we can look at those a little bit later. Because these 3.5 billion year old prokaryotes use photosynthesis, suggests that life first evolved earlier, maybe even 3.9 billion years ago. But we won't really concern ourselves with too many dates along this timeline. We have to know when it started, and that was 4.6 billion years ago, but everything else is just relative. So here's sort of some layers that we might find in a stromatolite. That's kind of what they are. So life evolves in 4 stages, and this is really the only thing that I'll say about these, and so it is helpful to kind of have an idea of these. But there were abiotic non-living synthesis of small organic molecules like amino acids, which make up proteins, remember? And nitrogenous bases, which make up our 2 nucleic acids, DNA and RNA. So probably putting together some of those important molecules. Then we have the joining of these small molecules into polymers. So first we just have kind of small organic molecules. Then we have polymers, or these big kind of macromolecules with proteins and nucleic acids. Then they start packaging into these protocells, which are just kind of like pre-cells. They're just membrane enclosed droplets. Okay, so they're probably enclosed by like some lipids, almost like a little soap bubble. And then we'll actually get origin of self-replicating molecules that eventually made inheritance possible. Where they started figuring some of this out, this is actually called the Miller-Urey experiment. I'm not going to get into any of the specifics, but they were actually able to do this by boiling kind of some seawater, having water vapor, having some kind of, it's supposed to be atmospheric in here, and this is supposed to be kind of like lightning. So they're kind of simulating conditions of lots of lightning, whatever condenses down with cold water, and they'll actually get this sample down here, which included some proteins and nucleic acids, which gave them the idea that those 4 things start. They did use some other experiments in order to figure out the other 3 and 4 of those major parts of life, but they get really complex and complicated, so kind of tend to move through them for your benefit. Okay. All right, now let's talk about the major events in history of life. So I'd ideally like to get through a few other terms, but we'll just see how far we make it. Okay. So macroevolution is a broad pattern of changes in the life on Earth. So macro, hopefully you've learned, it means big or large. So this is evolution on the big scale. When we look at evolution in species, it's called microevolution. It's on the small scale because we're looking at kind of little patterns within one species. But in this one, we're talking about big patterns in kind of all life on Earth. So that's the big evolution. So the entire 4.6 billion years of Earth's history can be divided into 3 eons of geologic time. These the Archean, the Proterozoic eons, and they lasted about 4 billion years. And the Phanerozoic is the last one, which has been the last half billion years. Okay. You don't have to know those per se, they don't show up a whole lot, but at least if you're into it, that's a good thing to know. If that's an area that interests you, it gives you a place to start. Okay. Yeah, so these are sort of where we're at. There might have been one a little bit earlier, but the Archean, the Proterozoic, and then where we're at to present is in the Phanerozoic. So we are here. Okay. All right, prokaryotes lived alone on Earth for 1.5 billion years. I'm sure they enjoyed it too. They were by themselves. They didn't have to deal with these silly humans polluting everything. So they lived by themselves for a long time. And remember, prokaryotes, just so you know, those are the things with no nucleus. So they're the really small things, kind of like bacteria. All right. During this time that they lived and kind of reigned, prokaryotes transformed to the atmosphere, so they were responsible for that. Prokaryotic photosynthesis produced oxygen that enriched the water and atmosphere of Earth, so they actually were responsible for kind of cleaning up the place. Right, we did get aerobic cellular respiration, and that allowed prokaryotes to flourish even more. So those basic things that we learned about, they continue to do them. The oldest fossils of eukaryotes are about 1.8 billion years old. They're old, really old. The common ancestor of all multicellular eukaryotes lived about 1.5 billion years ago. The oldest fossils of multicellular eukaryotes are about 1.2 billion years ago. And the first multicellular plants and fungi began to colonize about 500 million years ago. So it just kind of gives you an idea of the timeline, but we don't have to go into specifics about the billions of years. So we just kind of had prokaryotes and then eukaryotes and then multicellular eukaryotes. Let's see, and then just kind of seeing them a little bit more, and then multicellular plants and fungi. So you can kind of see the order of what we're starting to see evolve on the big scale, on the macroevolution scale. Humans diverged from other primates probably between 6 and 7 million years ago, and there's more information on that, I think, every day. I do believe that there was something, they found some fossils of something that kind of linked humans to other primates. I'll have to look that one up before I start saying the wrong thing. Our species, Homo sapiens, originated about 195,000 years ago. So if the clock on Earth's history were to rescale to the present hour, humans, so within the whole like 4.6 billion years of Earth in 1 hour, humans actually appeared in less than 0.2 seconds ago. So we are just a blip on that radar. Not, you know, we're babies. So how we talk about all these datings of things. These were 4.6 million years ago. These were 1.5. These were 195,000 years ago. There's a lot of dates. So how do we figure out that date? And this is actually really good stuff. So they actually do stuff called radiometric dating. And this is based on the decay of radioactive isotopes. That one's kind of hard to mention, but if you're into that stuff, and since you guys have had a little chemistry, I can give you the synopsis on that basically. So isotopes, really quickly, they have a differing number of neutrons, and sometimes when they're radioactive, they have so many protons and neutrons in their nucleus that they're not stable. They move around. They don't feel right. They're kind of jittery. So they'll actually throw off like either protons or neutrons or some combination thereof and change the element in order to become stable. So them losing a proton actually makes them a different element. And so you can actually gauge the old element versus the new element in a ratio for the radioactive isotopes. Now I can guarantee you the STAR test won't ask you about that one. So if that's beyond your grasp, that's okay. I'll show you the graph, but that's the explanation. All right. So the rate of decay is usually expressed as what we call a half-life, and that's half the life of that isotope. So the time required for 50% of that isotope in a sample to decay. So for it to become or start as the old element and to 50% of that old element to become a new element. And I'll show you a little graph which hopefully explains that a little bit better, but you can compare these two and that'll give you a half-life. So carbon-14 is, for example, has an unstable nucleus and it's used a lot, but it can only be used for up to 75,000 years ago. So radioactive isotopes with longer half-lives are used to date older fossils, obviously. So here's sort of what it would look like. God, I don't know what carbon-14 becomes. I think this is where I pause the video and then I go figure it out. Oh, the quick power of Google. Okay, so what we're actually comparing is if half the sample is still carbon-14, the other half of the sample, oh, actually, I'm doing that wrong. So the whole part up here is how much carbon-14. So if we have half of it is nitrogen-14, and then this half is still carbon-14, then we have one half-life. So you get a sample and half of it's nitrogen and the other half of it's carbon, and then we know 5.7 thousand years have occurred. Same thing as 3/4 of that sample is nitrogen-14, and then just 1/4 of it is carbon-14. Then we've got another half-life. So this particular sample from here to here has decayed 1/2. So then we get 11.4 thousand years ago. Okay, so it just goes by halves all the way down. So it doesn't entirely decay, but it's just the amount of time for half that sample. How they figured all that stuff out, I do not know, but that's how half-lives work. Okay. If you're not sure, if that doesn't make sense to you, just ask. Okay, we're at 12 minutes. This is a good time to take a break and then come back. Make sure you chunk your notes, take a look at them again, write a couple of questions, and then keep moving. So a fossil's age can be inferred by the ages of the rock layers above and below the stratum in which it's found. Stratum just means layer. So obviously if we've got like 3 layers, and let's see if I can draw a fish, and I want to make like it's supposed to be a seashell, just bear with me, and I don't know, like it's part of a leaf of a plant. Bear with me. So if we have these things, then this one down here is obviously older because it was in a rock layer found below. So the oldest is the fish, the seashell is in the middle, and the crazy looking thing that's supposed to be a leaf of a plant would be the youngest. Easy peasy. All right, the geologic record. So geo usually means earth. So we're talking about the record that's found in earth. Is based on the sequence and the ages of the fossils in that rock strata. In the most recent Phanerozoic eon, which we're in, it includes the past 542 million years and can be divided into 3 eras: Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Okay. And the boundaries between these eras are marked by mass extinctions. So that is one of the things that we know is the thing that separates different eras are mass extinctions. And that's just epic loss of lots of things. So I left a big chart on here and it's hard to tell, but these are different eras. Paleozoic is the oldest. Paleo means old. There would be an extinction here. And then between the Mesozoic and Cenozoic, we had an extinction here. And we haven't had, I think, our mass extinction yet for this one, but that's where we are. Okay, so extinction of many marine and terrestrial organisms at the end of the Paleozoic era. And let's see, this was dinosaurs were at the end of the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. Okay, so dinos. That was between the Mesozoic and the Cenozoic. All right, let's see. Are we going to cover mechanisms of macroevolution? I think so. I think that is part of what we had. I forgot we were doing this one. So, I did. I thought we were moving that one. What are the mechanisms of macroevolution? That's a good, so now we'll have a third one. I'm sorry. Sometimes we got to do it. So what are the mechanisms of macroevolution? So what makes those changes happen? So one of the major things is the theory of plate tectonics, and hopefully you've learned that at a certain point, but the Earth's crust is divided into these giant irregular shaped plates that essentially float on the underlying mantle. Okay? It's a process called continental drift, where those continents kind of drift. And the movements in the mantle cause the plates to move. So since the origin of multicellular life around 1.5 billion years ago, there have been 3 occasions in which land masses of Earth have come together to form a supercontinent. Okay, so here's the crust, that's what we live on, the mantle is below, and it's sort of a liquidy thing that our crust flows on, or floats on. Here are plate tectonics, so where some of these plates kind of are, and we know where there happen to be volcanoes and things like that. They occur kind of along these fault lines. So those are our major plates that you could take a look at. Okay. About 250 million years ago, plate movements brought all the land masses together and formed a supercontinent called Pangaea. Remember that? And that was formed. The physical environment and climate changed dramatically, and biological diversity was reshaped. So if all those continents and land masses come together, it will actually change that physical environment. Okay. During the Mesozoic era, Pangaea started to break apart. So this was kind of the Meso means middle. So this is the era in the middle. This is at the end of this one is when the dinosaurs died tragically. But Pangaea started to break apart, causing a geographic isolation of colossal proportions. By the end of the Mesozoic era, some 65 million years ago, the modern continents were beginning to take shape. So it would have been at the end here. The history of the continental merges and separation explains patterns of biogeography, so that's life on Earth and kind of mapped out. So something along those lines. So the study of the past and present distribution of organisms. All right, so sort of what it would look like, Pangaea at the beginning of the Mesozoic, all formed together and then eventually breaking apart. And so at the end of the Mesozoic, it sort of looks modern, not exactly. We move a little bit further apart, and now at kind of our portion of the Cenozoic, this is where we are. Volcanoes and earthquakes result from movements of the crustal plates as they kind of come together. We can get mountains and volcanoes, and earthquakes as they kind of slide past one another. The boundaries of plates are hotspots of volcanic and earthquake activity. California's frequent earthquakes are a result along that infamous San Andreas Fault, and it's part of the border between the Pacific and North American plates, and they grind together and gradually slide past each other. I haven't seen it, but there is that movie called San Andreas. Is that it's sort of recent. Anybody seen it? Does it actually fit in with this? Does it kind of give us an idea about plate tectonics in that particular area? You'll have to make a note and share that with me on our next class period. But here's where we can see it. So there's California, and right along this plate is that San Andreas Fault. And if we were to go out there, you could actually see that particular fault line in the ground. It is pretty drastic. Okay. It's a good place to stop as we move into the next part, so it is a good place to take a break, and then come back. So extinction is inevitable in a changing world. The fossil record shows that the vast majority of species that have ever lived are now extinct. Over the last 500 million years, 5 mass extinctions have occurred in each event. More than 50% of the Earth's species went extinct. Sad face. Okay, so we've had like 5 of these guys. There was a Permian mass extinction, and that occurred about 251 million years ago, and it defines the boundaries between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic eras. We sort of talked about before. So this claimed 96% of the marine species and took a tremendous toll on the terrestrial life. It's like almost all marine animals were wiped out. All the things that live in the sea. The Cretaceous period, or the Cretaceous mass extinction, was about 65 million years ago, and this caused a loss of more than half of the marine species. So the marine species, the stuff out in the sea, are just getting bombarded here each time. And many lineages of terrestrial plants and animals were destroyed. This resulted in the extinction of almost all the dinosaurs, except for birds. They could fly away from it. Good on them. Okay. And this was likely what caused likely caused by a large asteroid that struck the Earth, which would have blocked life and severely disturbed the global climates for months. So that's the hypothesis. Again, we take all this stuff with kind of a grain of salt because we weren't there for the beginning of these things. So we use certain scientists' data to get us these answers, but I know personally I wasn't there. So I trust their work, but realize that there's always room for error or change, or there's actually always room for, if you're really into this kind of stuff, there's room for you to help figure it out and make sure that it's accurate with modern technology and stuff. But here's sort of what where it comes from is that an asteroid hit kind of near the Yucatan Peninsula, and then, you know, everybody had a bad time, except for birds. Good job, birds. All right, so mass extinctions affect biological diversity profoundly when you lose them. I mean, think about when we talked about founder's effect, or I guess bottlenecking is more closely to it, is remember you can wipe out whole parts of that gene pool that would have been there. So mass extinctions kind of work like bottlenecking. So just to kind of give you an idea of wrapping that into it. It's like the bottleneck effect. You lose a whole lot. Okay, plus you take out, like you could take out potentially, when we get into ecology, you take out something's predator or something's food source. So you affect the diversity that way as well. And actually losing a predator or even losing food sources can have equally negative responses or effects on one particular species that would potentially survive. So we'll talk about all that stuff later, but you can get the bottleneck effect as things are wiped out, and then also you'll lose things that keep it in check, like predators and its food source. So things to think about. It took about 100 million years for a number of marine families to recover from the Permian mass extinction, and this is always the question to bear in mind: is there a sixth extinction underway? So the current extinction rate is 100 to 1,000 times the normal background rate. So things just regularly go extinct. But we're noticing kind of a speeding up in things becoming extinct. And this is tricky. So it may take millions of years for life on Earth to recover. Poor Earth will have to recover from its human infection. All right, so adaptive radiations are periods of evolutionary change in which many new species evolve from a new common ancestor, often following the colonization of new unexploited areas. This is also how extinction affects things as well. So adaptive radiations have also followed each mass extinction. So we started off with some and they were kept maybe in this area, but as there are islands or other areas that they couldn't occupy before, they start moving out into those areas and adapting, and so we get kind of lots of different species. Okay, so survivors become adapted to the vacant ecological roles or niches in that community. So for example, mammals underwent a dramatic adaptive radiation after the extinction of terrestrial dinosaurs about 65 million years ago. So because, you know, dinosaurs dominated it, once they were extinct, mammals could actually radiate outward and kind of occupy those particular niches. Okay, so here's our maybe reptilian ancestors, and then we got this kind of radiation outwards from mammals and of various kinds. Okay, so the fossil record can tell us a couple of things. It tells us what great events in the history of life have been and when they occurred. We've got continental drifts, kind of an idea of when they happened, mass extinctions, adaptive radiations, and those provide a big picture of how those changes came about. We're now increasingly able to understand the basic biological mechanisms that underlie the changes we see in the fossil record. So we can actually explain the fossil record that we see to get an idea. Okay, there's a field called Evo-Devo, and this addresses the interface of evolutionary biology and the developmental biology, so it's evolution and development, and examines how slight genetic changes can provide major morphological differences. So genes that provide development control the rate, timing, and spatial patterns as organisms form and develop. All right, so that's evolutionary development. Oh, we can finish these. These are some quick definitions. We'll try to get them done. But there's some striking evolutionary transformations that result from change in the rate or timing of developmental events. Pedomorphosis, pedo kind of refers to like juvenile or let's go juvenile on that one. So juvenile morph is a form, so it's a process where we make a juvenile form. So this is the retention or the keeping of adult body structures that were juvenile features in the ancestral species. So we keep the kind of kid form of certain body structures. So what that would occur in is the oxalotl salamander, in which sexually mature adults actually retain gills and other features that are normally found in the larva. So here's an oxalotl. He is adorable. Quite possibly one of my favorite little salamanders. You can actually get slight changes in the relative growth of different body parts, and they can change from the adult form substantially. Skulls of humans and chimpanzees are more similar as fetuses, but quite different as adults due to different growth rates. So we look very similar to chimpanzees and as babies, but as we get growth and development and different expression of genetics and things like that, you get some vastly different appearances. Okay, and I think that's where I wanted to end it. I'll talk to you about a few other things that are really interesting, but start there. If you have any questions at all, shoot me an email or come to class with them and we'll get them sorted out.